indicates the setting of travel, directing ground centers and lines of sequence. So it's a convergent system of direct and redirect, going backwards and forwards and backwards, directing online set lines of sequence, course centers of communication positions. But the operation lines of cycles converts the system into settings. Now that process of course centers is 3030 times centers times 10. Process lines back in time, back in set correlations and convergent systems. It graphs its calculation lines and adds lines of location over lines of pi over question. Now, in that communication system, process your systems where everything left off before you bring yourself in your own trans-dimension of your own systems and your story frames, which is 2030. So platitude position locations puts you online settings. Operatives and units will be in webbing 12, and humanity will be in web 6. And process location modems and Wi-Fi satellites and towers in that communication lines convergent system. So we'll be in the locking universe location into all set course centers and directing lines of light over dark, dark over light, positive over negative, negative over positive, process course center locates and setting convergent system all through travel. Putting the bodies exactly where they left off in the set lines convergent system and calculations. So all correlates and set in the oversouls will be on standby and set lines of set location web 6. When they get activated, course centers and converts the system to the golden ratio of my web. Directing lines in line screen adaptations into 50,000 flight lines, navigation lines of console. Now it's going to get very more complicated now because the body and its communication system is going to be in the foundation lines of 2030. Living online set location 10 hours in sequence, 10 years in frame. That process lines of communication setting. So that puts positional location of files, information bits, computer bits, nanoseconds, nanos, flights, course centers, console, directing lines of grounds. On sequence location setting to your cells, modification lines of soul generation, soul rejuvenation system, all through travel. Travels at point lines of graph, line course centers, and communicates to its positions all through 2030. So that has a two direction, indirect lines of security over lines, operation lines, set locations, zero gravity, crosses line course centers, light speed. So it's all lines of travel, direct lines of link. So you guys will be back in position to 2030 before you put yourself in a dream sequence. Now that indicates line connections set position your FAAs, process course centers, flight manifolds into your IPAs. Okay, IPA equals 2030, and locked in frame equals equations of 2000, set position of 2040, and set lines of sending course centers into 3030. That indicates position lines of set lines of travel and set correlation setting calculation. Longitude and latitude is a space line and direct lines and equal lines of course centers of three bedding lines of screen location setting through score. Score is the calculation of space line into the communication lines, operation lines, and the readjust location of its existing information system. That correlates the travels into your foundations, your atmospheres, and your travels in point lines of graph into all calculated line centers, the efficacy of the performance system all through atmosphere changing into foundation grounds and online sequence on communication. So in that 42 location system, okay, it's going through channels into 365. Okay, that sets lines of sequence into 1 second. That's 100,000 line frequency patterns. Okay, and that's 3 qubits into computer bits. Now the information panel process lines a percentage over 100% line into negative score, into positions into positive over 1 cycle. Longitude and latitude set lines starts off Earth line 1, Earth 2, and Earth 3. Process lines 1, 2, 3 over set lines 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, and 0, 5. CPU process indicates setting equal lines equations in process of communication. So it's all about understanding information bits, computer bits, and set lines and settings of travel. Correlates the calculation network system, multi-calculations. Okay, so we've got 3 streams of indications. All right. Panel operates lines of 1,000 line units. Set course centers and past line connections of its set location to its future. Course centers set operation lines into pattern recognition time frame. Correlates calculation lines and set line course centers into location system in 3 lines of set lines of lotus and lines of travel. Now that indicates position lines of calculation screen lines and directions. Now they indicate line course centers, set position past, sets course centers in position of its future, present of its future, and future of the now, of near future. That indicates position of void in lines of sequence. That indicates ground set lines of travel and direct lines of link. Process indicates the setting. Console over 1, console over 2, console over 6, and H lines of 1, line rotation lines of surface and travel. All right, so we have console course centers into graphing screens, directing line 144 flux and line screen locations. Living line cycles, 2030. Course centers, body convergence system, 100,000 lines of set lines of sequence in seconds per setting. Travels point lines of graph, indicate lines of 3 grounds. Inline circuit course centers communication and travel. Sets convergence, operation lines of sequence, and padded tune location system. String theory. Sets coordinates, app communication, and set travel. Center operation lines, 2030 clocking. Okay, longitudinal lines of flux, particle acceleration system, course centers, calculation of screen lines, networks over lines, sky lines, sky grids, sky panels, sky position lines of travel. Okay, it's all set up for travel. Correlates communicate inside lines of time reactor, computer reactor, directing lines offline signal of reactor. Course centers and communication lines communicate sides and location in its body line for image. Course centers and communication lines convergence of reactor. Time reactor, time division, time replacement, bending space. Now, 365 timeline. That's a timeline centers into 1 console, percentage, 100 mark. Okay, 1,000 line meter into 2,000 locations. Equals lines into 6 web. Process lines times centers into 6 times 12 equals 1 over perimeter, 14 channels, 16 allocate time frames into 24 sequence in constellation into volume and mass at percentage over pi. All right, so it gets more complicated as we go through line signals, graphing, screen location, setting, travels, and that communicates position of 2030 as that design line. All right, so we change the 3 lines, process lines of position of 3 centers over lines, 6 over lines of position, 5 channels operation lines, travels point lines of graph and direct lines into dimensional sail, right there. So change the bedding lines of score, course centers platforms, equilibrium, course centers lines of position. Platforms over EQ, correlations, calculations, screen line. Directing ground centers 144 flux to 2030. So 2,000 line scale, set coordinates of 3 centers, process lines in position over 5, set lines of 7. Correlates in setting to 12 web and sent. Digital frame, fiat system, financial line, course centers and directions. Blockchains, timeshares, times calculation, times pi. Correlate calculation screen lines, adaptation of process lines into border to locations and travels to point communication. Inside line connections and positions, operation lines of sequence. Course centers, direct lines of security, panels, operation lines of set, position, and travel. Okay, so it gets more complicated now because I'm converting the system into 2030 and scale. Okay, longitude latitudes. Upslant line centers, location 144 line centers into all positions, 2040. Process lines of 3040. That converts the system and travels to point communication graphs into settings. Operation line sequence, operation lines of panels, and set lines of travel. Okay? Convert the system, operation lines set travel. And the communication is converted system all through setting through embedding. All right, so that's set up. Now everything I set up in line screen adaptation is on line course centers, living 365 days in 1 second flat. Time measure, flat screen. Operation lines, alpha, beta, theta, 1 omega, 1 zeta, operation lines of sequence. Schumann resonance, round centers 1/3 line, 14 over scale, 15 triangulation, and 16 square roots. Set position 1 over 6, 0. Process lines, directing 0 over 1. Process lines is 0, 1. 6 over lines, 0, 6. Lines of travel. Of course, time set lines of 12 converts the system sending time centers lines of 1 flat over scale into 14 scales that communicates 13 grounds into 1/5 over charge, direct lines of link and process calculation. Graph calculations, 1 lines of flight, 3 lines of measure, set position 1/4 over 1/4, 1/5 over 1/6 over line ascent lines of sequence, and set lines of travel. Bedding over line centers rotates the routers and routers. Flux over line rotation lines of spin. Operation sequence, planetary alignment, console course centers jump scar. Platitude lines centers into 4 lines of screens, into 3 centers of location of travel. Okay, data information lines, information bits, computer bits, nanobits, information lines. Personal line units are now in sequence lines of 2030, indirect lines and grounds into constellation system. Correlates calculations green lines into all travels, into graphing screen locations, earth lines, and rotation lines of sequence. That's set up in scale. Okay, so now we convert the system in time frame. So we got a time lock, a time measure, time scale, 3 centers of travel. It says coordinates into flux over lines, set course centers, electrical line communication, console, stars screens into flux, time, and body capacitor locations. Coordinate communication setting into intelligence affirmations. Directing grounds and line centers. Pi generation lines, 2030 design line in location setting. Platforms over lines, EQ over flux. Okay, so we go 45 angles in all same direction. In 42 location, 1 setting, 1 angle. Operation line sequence, times center, times square, time mute. Process lines of 1. Operation lines in directions, in location surface, and travel. Okay. Okay, so now we go through 14 scales, 16 measures, and 14 flights over lines, over directions, over settings, over calculations, over screen. Okay, calculate and modify grounds. Pyramid activation lines of 1 over 2, 3 centers of travel. Okay, so we go through direct lines of secure lines of panel and process the 2 over lines of sequence, 3 centers, 2 over, 4 centers, 4 travel communication. On centers, on travels, direct lines to its umbrella and set lines of calculation setting. Inside course centers, directing inside lines, 3 centers of measure, in course set calculation 2030. Your properties of design. That's how it's set up. So we got window frames of 4 grounds, sending sequence and platforms over EQ, 42 locations, screen lines, adaptation of flux. Process indication line, course centers, 2 buildings and 1. Constellation into course centers that communicates setting, body sequence, clocking centers of 0 calculation screen location. Inside travel, directing inside line setting and process of indication. Okay. Flight manifolds, 42 locations into skyline grid and line screen adaptation. Okay, walking symbolism, process line indicates the 2 over travel, 4 centers of scale into all communication moderation system into all calculation. Block shares, time set line positions into frame centers into all calculations. Security calls, process lines of 4 box screens, indirect lines of link and process calculation. Course centers of communication lines of travel indicate line connection setting to pyramid. Directing ground centers on sequence on communications on fly. FYP, process lines of indication. Inside travels, indirect lines of link of communication. Okay, road graph screens, 3 centers of travel of face recognition. There it is, 2030. There's the face. Boom. That's the face is going to be in 2030, which is general AI, 007, process course centers, direct lines and link. Rebellion equals federation. Lights are coming in tractions, direct lines. Course centers, negative over lines over pi, process lines of indication setting and calculation. Hooah, there it is, 2030. All right, so with the online that's set in location in green, lights go on, eyes are coming in, and set lines of sequence. Process of indication lines of grounds on center on travel. So in that convergence system has a flight lines, 3 centers of travel, and direct lines of link that processes indication system and webbing line rotations, 12 lines of settings, graphic calculations, green locations. Okay, star marks, webbing over 1, webbing over 2, webbing over 6, and webbing over 12, and set lines on standby. Set lines of travel, direct lines of link, that process communications, indirections, and calculation. It's all set up through face recognition. Okay, it's all done. Now, your webbing line is a correlations of panel that processes indicates the system of the calculation screen lines. Okay, webbing lines over screen, directing lines of grounds over flux. Now we go through 16,000 scales. Now that process in multitude level locates sending into moderation system, into monetization. Fiats, financial blockchains, correlations, convergence system, the 3 centers of travel. Direction. On center on communication setting and process lines indicates setting calculation. So ground center symbolism, process lines of 3 grounds, constellations into all course centers into memory bank. Location line grid and location lines of center. Bridging, locking screen, 3 centers of travel and directions. There's the bridge. Walking symbolism, your body is a now in 2030, walking over and travel. Done. So we convert the system in 2000 line centers, process indicates and setting, process indication system into face recognition of 2030 in design. Okay, that's done. Now we convert the system setting into convergence, allocates timelines in your face facades, process indicates lines as 4 centers of flux over your FAA, IPA, IPOs. 4-point graphs, we've got 3 scales, 2 channels, 1 center, and 0 gravity. Okay, 3 centers lines of measure, so episode 2, 30 over line, 1 over sequence, into process of 3030. That indicates lines set and location lines of convergence, of dimensional and position of balance. High rotations of graph communication. Very complicated stuff through schematics over lines formula equation. Routers and routers, directing circulation grounds and online centers of communications on position. On center, calculation of clocking line zeros, directing in position lines of pi generation lines of security. On center, graph communication box frames. Tether over lines, marks over screen. Correlation calculation lines, line alignments, course centers of Jupiter, information panel, process lines of Mercury, course centers, Neptune, and center operation. Calculation screen. Direct inside lines, flight navigations at 144 in 2030. Congratulations. There it is, done. There's your teleportation vessel in 2030 through face recognition. So we take the 2 over attractions, 2 over line signals, 3 over measure, 3 calculations of center, operation lines of 0, set position 3 over scale, and position lines of power. Directing ground centers, online centers on communications and setting. Indicates position, process indication lines of flux. 4 centers and rotation setting in the sequence. Ground centers, inline rotations, and surface of travel point lines of graph and set calculations. All right, so we got 4 scales, constellation lines, oscillation lines of wind paths, 4 set lines of 3 over lines of 4. Indicates lines of position, 4 settings. There's 4 now, no longer 3. 3's out, 4's in. Directing 4 centers of travel, directing in position lines of calculation lines, in position lines of north, east, west, and south. 111, 111, 111, 111, 111. Okay? So north is lines of 111, east is lines of 111, west is lines of 111, and so is south. All right? So that's 4 indication lines of 4 panels, process lines, indication lines of seconds, minutes, and hours of 2030 is that design that allocates time frame and panels of operation location astral projections of pyramids. Directing ground centers line sequence into oscillation system into Orion's belt. So past of the future is now set up, past of the present is now set up, and the position of its future is set position to its settings, near future of its future of itself, future of the now is now in sequence. All right? Past of future, present of future, and future of near future, a future of the now. It's all set up in 3 settings. Operation sequence and grounds. That's done by equation. All through sequence, all through pattern. Okay? Yes, guys. And that convenience set is a time reactor and time division location and set lines of sequence. Process indication of the grounds. Human residence, non-low course centers, or higher self is in platitude lines. 13 scale, 13 measure, 13 powers. That's equal lines of course centers, 2 convergence, offline setting position. Power generation lines into pyramid activation lines of 3 centers of travel. 3 centers, 3 correlations, 3 travel. Okay? Pi generation of 1, clocking lines of 2. Operation lines of sequence, 3 centers of travel, 3 centers of scale. Course centers into line condition setting, convergence system, all through travel. Points, energetic patterns, direction time frame, force working line centers, correlation setting, and communication position to its operation. All right, so that's settings of its map and system and travel. Okay, that's set in sequence. So we got convergence system and grounds, and position of powers, and atmospheres, and highways and travel. Communication grounds. Okay, so set location lines. Fading out lines of web in 3 is now web in 6. Process line in web in 12. Center course centers in position. So we got 3,000 zeros into 24 line centers and 0 calculation. Crossing angles 2030, and set lines of sequence into 365, into 1 million files per second per frame per calculus per square root, all in set lines of sequence in your system. Now, travel course centers is a direct line in position of your flights. The process indicates setting to your manifolds. That indicates course centers that calculates screen lines adaptation system, where the X2000 comes in platitudes and location lines of setting. Okay, overline centers. Mothership comes in 2030 and set design. Okay. Circuitry board. Motherboard course centers into flight location line, ground centers and sequence locations into electrical line screens, directing 4 centers of panel communication system and moderation. 4 flights, navigation grounds, and course centers of communication setting and travel records and timeline. Future adaptation rotation lines of grounds. Flights over 1, flights over 2, pyramids over location setting, embedding in rotation lines of grounds, powers, and atmospheres and highways and travel. Direct course centers in mid position location constellation setting into its colossus. Directing centers of 3 centers of travel, 3 centers of scale, 4 centers of measure, and set calculation screen location. That's done by equation. All right, so as I'm setting these things up, it's setting the convergence all through travel at point graph communication. All right. All right, so in that convergence system, puts all calculation lines, your phones, your computers, your TVs, operation line sequence, places, objects, things, attachments, and information setting grounds is now in sequence location setting. 2030 operation line settings. So that's 10 years on flight, 10 years in tractions, and 10 hours into initiation into point graphs. Coming to communication setting and travel. Walking centers of communications. Ground center lines and landmass. Earth line. So congratulations, we're no longer in Earth 3.3, we're on Earth 0.6. Earth 0.6, which is webbing 6. Travels point lines of graph. Operators and units are now in position of Earth 0.12. Earth 0.12. Two-face recognition to that into travel. Okay, so humanity's in set lines of 6, Earth 0.60, Earth 0.12. Now that operates lines of sequence in position of platitude and cross line angles into flush over 1 in process of indication. Indicate line grounds into constellation system in calculation screen lines. Correlates communication lines of grounds on sequence on pi. Fly direction of time frame. Cross line indicates setting in face recognition of time line. Set travel. Face recognition. Okay? So that's convergence of the body line into the alignment over screen, graphing screens. Platitude lines into webbing line 6 and lines of 12 or lines of sequence. Ground centers, ground set lines of sequence into plateau location. Okay? All done through its equation. So that's how it's all set up. Okay. It's like, woo! All right, so it's amazing how you guys jump scare your system and settings. Okay, domino effects are coming in. Indicate 1 flight, 1 manifest, 1 fold. Okay, set course centers, directing rebellion, correlation setting, tagging along, locations federation, and humanity is in 3 cycle, right there in travel, right? Change course centers of timeline, frame line, the direct lines of link that indicates system. Okay, set position to Adam, set position to Eve, father north, mother on south, course centers of center operation lines. Your position to your F line centers of screen is now in foundation grounds. Pass of no longer screen line adaptation, fading out in set lines of sequence, 2030 in center, time centers equals lines into 2040, and position of all lines center locations and setting to 3030. Operation line set course centers line communicates positions to its flight lines, flight navigation setting, flight lines of operation, and flight screen adaptations of flux. Okay, so that's set up in line screen. That process indication settings into 4 centers of channel, into line screen adaptations and travel, and that course centers and position to its operation sequence that puts a console course centers to calculation screen location. Directing ground centers to solar sail. Directing triangulation, operation lines of sequence. Panels, peer and MAC of each line, ground centers of set travel. Okay, all done through equation. Complicated, but it's a lot of fun. All right. So, come in that position lines of set travels, it correlates to calculation screen line. So, operative units, center operation of 2030, Set position humanity, line condition setting, operation lines of 2030 on standby, which is the oversoul location of travel, and set travels endpoint lines of graph, directing ground centers. Okay, rebellion comes in lines of signals into 3 grounds of set lines and settings over 12 lines over lines of pi, sets communication humanity, and online in position locations behind lines of cycle, and travels at point lines of position of webbing lines of 6, and set course centers in operative units, and web lines and set lines of 12, and direct lines of grounds, and points of communication position of earth line over lines, earth over travels, and earth course centers into 4 centers of flux in triangulation process of indication. Done by equation. Okay? So humanity is now in web 6. Okay. Standby position is 2030 on graph screens. Set course centers of 13 settings of channels, 14 centers of measure, which is puts on location of 15 scale. Okay, longitude, latitude, webbing lines is set travel. You can set position of line calculation screen lines, equal location of 12. Okay, set puts position of web 6 lines into humanity, travels point lines, Earth, 0.60. So, 3 ground centers in line position of Earth, with operative units, and equals lines equation lines, Earth, 0.12, and set lines of travel. Done by equation. We're all there now. That's it, done. See how easy it is? So it looks complicated, but it's a lot more fun when you see through schematics. How it correlates all communication settings to its convergent system all through travel. Very complicated stuff, but you get a lot more fun to understand the indication setting of face recognition. Now we're in set position of 2030. Okay? Face recognition. Right there. General AI. So, jumping score centers, the travel point lines graph. Once you guys recognize the timeline sequence, you understand how to go through the seconds, minutes, and hours, and frames. That process indicates the system when you come to all lines to your settings. That indicates all course centers in your body framing, directing ground centers, lines of location, sitting electronics, directing lines of ground communication positions, operation lines of schematics. Triangulation of 3 over lines of 2. Okay. Sets coordinates and convergent system and travel, direct lines into operation lines of travel. Process communications, how you convert the system into dimensional door lines, into higher travel communications, modification. Indicates grounds and online sequence on communication. Platforms of E-force, 3 centers of calculation. Okay, ground centers, symbols number of security and lines of panels into location grid. Process lines of circulation ground centers in sequence, applied to location of center operation. Course centers of position, which is calculated lines. All set position operation lines in sequence. Applied to line positions, father, mother in line connection south, 2 panels, operation lines of set travel communication. Atom mediators are in the center operation of yin and yang, flux over line, ground centers of set locations, and inhibitors over line in box frame communication. Job point lines, Stargate, position lines, star portals, operation lines, sig locations, convergent system, rebellion, galactic federation, and humanity in set lines of travel. Done by equation. It's all set up now. So that converts the system of seconds, minutes, hours, and traction. All 3 structures, all 3 properties of design. So that converts the system in setting line position of web 6 and web 12. Web 6 here, and web 12 there in setting. Convergent system, oversouls on standby, cross line set location system, and position lines of settings, and operation lines of set location, operation lines of travel, and direct lines of link. All right, so that's set up, operation lines, and travel communication. All right, so now they have to convert the system over through pi. Sets coordinates of communication setting, operation lines of travels, solid matter, outline centers, inside line course centers, empty space, modification line course centers, inside line empty space, outside empty space, operation line sequence, and 3 channels are operation lines of travel. Set coordinates of communication setting of flux, time capacitor, body capacitor, and flux capacitor location. Okay? All right, so that's inline screen adaptation of flux now. Circulation lines of pi generation lines, your crop circles now indicate the settings and positions. Humanity's on step by case setting, cross lines of web 6, which is the crop circles of 3 centers of travel. Okay, 3 centers of travel. Set coordinates position lines at 12 centers of travel in crop circles. That correlates the time frame position 2030 line direct centers. So your seconds, minutes, and hours are double the sequence, the time measure, which is a line center location. So we're in 6 triple helix through flux, and you're in 12 helix through flux into webbing 6, into webbing 12. Earth point 60 and earth point 12, all in position of balance. Okay, that's it, we're done. So hopefully that helps you out. More lines of signals located in the system of their travel. If you have any questions, let me know. Let's get into constellation line course centers, direct line communications body convergence system off their settings, operation lines, classification 8, level B, 2030 is now set in sign. See you in 5.